Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Dr. Jeffrey Herbst. He is the fourth president in the 70-year history of American Jewish University. Prior to joining AJU, he was the president and CEO of the Newseum and the Newseum Institute in Washington, D.C., and from 2010 to 2015, he was the president of Colgate University. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Herbst. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. I've really been looking forward to this episode, in addition to the great work that you're doing, which I know we'll get into. You've written some great articles, one of which really caught my attention. You actually wrote it back in 2021, but I found it, I believe, in a Google search, talking about quote unquote ruinous competition and the Jewish future. So we'll talk about that as well. But first, before we get started, why don't you tell us about your background, where you're from, all the things that led you to where you are today?
Well, thanks so much. And thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast today. I'm most appreciative. I was born in New York City, but my parents quickly moved to Peekskill, New York, about 60 miles north of New York City. My father worked for IBM Fishkill for most of his career. I became interested in politics at a relatively young age and was a high school debater. And at that time, in the late 1970s, issues of scarce world resources and oil after the OPEC oil hikes were very much dominant in the news. So I ended up going to college and fell into studying the politics of sub-Saharan Africa, which I made my academic career, got a PhD, did my field work in Zimbabwe, which at the time was just emerging out of independence, and then went to Princeton and was a professor for 18 years, writing on various aspects of African politics, political economy, politics of economic and political reform, boundaries, military intervention, did work on the US-UN intervention in Somalia in early 1990s. I became chair of the politics department at Princeton, which was at that time the largest major in the university. Kind of got the administrative bug and was given the opportunity in the mid-2000s to become provost of Miami University in Ohio. And that was a challenge because going from a very well-resourced Ivy League school to a Midwestern university, which was about to face the recession in the Midwest, was very challenging, but had a great time in Ohio for 5 years and then became president of Colgate University in 2010 in upstate New York, which was a lot of fun to be in a small liberal arts college. After a while, I was looking for something different, something potentially non-academic or outside the traditional boundaries. And a few years later, became president and CEO of the Newseum in Washington, D.C., which was a museum dedicated to promoting the First Amendment that had both an academic and also a non-academic aspect. And that was a fascinating moment. This very much influenced some of the work I've done in the Jewish communal world, because I was looking at the tail end of the disruption of the entire news ecosystem caused by the internet, including the demise of local news. It's influenced my thinking a lot. Stayed at the Newseum for a few years and then was looking to do something more formally in the Jewish world. And fortunately, American Jewish University was looking for a new leader, and was delighted and honored to become president of that school in Los Angeles in 2018. And I'm just finishing my fourth year here.
Amazing. Thank you for that introduction. I want to go back to when you got into the administrative positions of universities outside of the Jewish world initially. There's a lot of talk today, obviously, about the anti-Semitism that's taking place on college campuses, the anti-Zionism. I just read an article recently that, the awareness is there, right? Meaning university administrators know that this is happening. And I'm sure there's also racist things about Blacks and about, Hispanics or Latinos. I mean, it's not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in the Jewish world matters to us, obviously. I'm just curious, going back to like your days in the Midwest and then going back to New York, being in an administrative, obviously very high level leadership position, like what was the sort of anti-Semitic situation back then? Did you feel it personally being Jewish yourself? And how has it changed in 2022 moving forward?
Yeah, I think things have evolved, and you're right to point out that things have changed over time. In fact, 10 and certainly 15 years ago, I was giving talks that said that the anti-Semitism that people were concerned about, let's say circa 2005, 2007 on college campuses was overblown, that it tended to be concentrated in a relatively few campuses on the East and West Coast. And certainly I experienced nothing at all at Miami of Ohio or at Colgate. But I'd say the situation has changed. And I think the data is irrefutable. If you look at what ADL or Hillel or any number of other organizations are putting out, Jews on a very large number of campuses feel threatened to one degree or another because of their Jewish identity and or their affiliation with Israel. Now, it's always hard to make generalizations about colleges and universities. There are 4,000 campuses in this country. You can find a bad story about almost anything, anywhere. But I think the accumulation of evidence over time is that in an increasing number of places, the legitimate debate about Israel, the Middle East, has spilled over into rhetoric that sometimes threatens Jewish students. And I think we saw that really explode after the most recent Gaza crisis last year.
When you're speaking to Jewish students, how do you speak to them? What do you say to them in terms of this Israel aspect, as you just mentioned? I mean, for me, it's very obvious that, part of it is not having the full education or tools available to them, understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By the way, it's a very complicated, conflict. It's not something that can be explained in a 30-second Instagram video or a 2-minute news piece or a 13-second TikTok video. What are some of the conversations that you've had with students and your peers as well, administrators, in terms of dealing with it here and now?
In terms of students, I would say to Jewish students the exact same thing I would say to any other student, which is you should not be afraid on your campus to voice your opinion and express your identity in any way you feel legitimate. That's not a Jewish issue. That's an issue for all students. And lots of other students on college campuses feel pressures. For all their problems, a residential college is really the most, outside of military bases, the most ethnically, racially diverse setting in American society. There are challenges, but at least these places are trying to have people live together. But I don't think people should be afraid. I say that you should educate yourself. You should not feel that because you're Jewish, you are an ambassador of Israel, but neither should you feel in any way that you should be discriminated against because of your views on Israel. I'm more critical, and you may have seen an article I wrote last year, frankly, of college administrators, which, while the situation varies across campuses, and like I said, there are thousands of college campuses in the United States, and anyone can find a bad example somewhere. I don't think for a long time that university administrators took the anti-Semitism which was appearing on campuses seriously enough, in part because Jews are often coded as white on college campuses, even though that's an increasingly problematic description as the young Jewish population becomes more multiracial. And in the official mind of many college bureaucracies, white students do not face discrimination. I think people are learning otherwise now, but also the fact that many of the attacks on Jewish students come from the left, come from people of color themselves, has also made the traditional understandings of conflict on college campuses difficult. It just doesn't fit into the template that college administrators are used to. That requires education. requires courage on the part of college administrators. Look, I headed a museum which celebrated the First Amendment, and I'm as much in favor of free expression as anyone. A lot of college professors have their own views on the Middle East. Those are their own views, so be it. But I was extremely disturbed during the Gaza conflict in 2021 that units of universities, departments, women's studies programs, and the like started taking official positions on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, always to the detriment of Israel. And that struck me as exceptionally problematic. It's one thing for individual professors to have views, so be it. But they cannot take the institutions that they are part of and orientate those institutions in a particular way that really diminishes free speech on campus, and I think leads to an atmosphere where many Jewish students feel threatened.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. You know, when you talk about marginalized groups of people, I mean, it's obviously pretty black or white, no pun intended. But when it comes to the Israeli, for example, if we're talking about affirmative action and African Americans, like it's hard, whether you agree with affirmative action or not is one thing, but it's hard to, all the facts point that African Americans have been, not just for slaves, of course, but have been, there's been a lot of institutionalized racism targeted at them and other minority groups. And a reasonable person can look at the facts and say, we should improve some of our institutions and how they deal with minorities and specifically African Americans. When you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to say that you have to pick sides, to me, is just a complete lack of understanding of the conflict itself, because the way that I see it is you can pick both of them together. It's not either or. I mean, you can basically say, the Israelis and the Jews, which have their own state, which is recognized by countries around the world, you can, be in favor of a Jewish state, and you can also be in favor simultaneously for Palestinian right to their own, sovereignty and having their own state. Like, to me, when people start choosing sides, it either tells me that they just have no understanding whatsoever of the conflict itself, or they do have an understanding of it, but they're purposely taking a side against Israel because ultimately they're anti-Semitic or they have anti-Semitic undertones. I'm just curious, when I paint that picture, what goes through your mind?
Well, I mean, I agree that these are complicated questions. Look, there's a debate in Israel about these issues, which is as or more wide-ranging than what you'll find on college campuses. And people should feel passionately about the issues they're concerned about, whether it's one side or another of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or how China treats its minorities, or the war in Ukraine. Lots of issues to feel passionate about. I believe that people should be passionate about their beliefs, but there's a line that when it crosses over from debating the issues to where individuals feel threatened because their identity is being challenged, that line should not be crossed. And I think we've done in the United States a rather poor job in the last 10 or 15 years of figuring how to debate the issues, how to debate them passionately, how to recognize there are legitimate points on various sides without demeaning and insulting each other. And one of the things that I think colleges should do is model how to have passionate but civil debate. Unfortunately, quite often on Israel-Palestine, we don't see that happening on many college campuses.
So at a certain point, I guess the leadership of universities, has to come into question, right? Because it feels to me that, just like with any organization, the leadership always sets the tone of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. That I know in a university, it's a bit different because you have students which are not employees technically of, so it's not a typical nonprofit or for-profit organization. But if you had a magic wand and you could affect the kind of change that you would want to affect on a macro level, meaning widespread university and university leadership, like, what would you want to see happen across not just US universities, but universities across the world?
Well, as I said, the situation varies enormously. The New York Times, for instance, will focus on about 5 East Coast universities and make generalizations. But the data that's now come in from Hillel and lots of other places suggests there's a problem on college campuses where there's any recognizable Jewish population. I know many college and university leaders. I've spoken with many of them. Look, to a fault, they want all of their students, Jewish, non-Jewish, of every race and ethnicity, of any identity, to prosper on campuses. That's not the question. But college campuses are very complex places. Residential campuses want to teach people, they want to house people, they want to entertain people, they want to feed people. And while university presidents certainly set a tone, it's also deep within the structure of universities that determine how comfortable students are, the structure. And as I said, I don't think that many in university bureaucracies have absorbed the fact that anti-Semitism is a real threat to many Jewish students, given that it falls outside the template of traditional understandings of bias and prejudice. And I think if we could have more people in college bureaucracies understand that Jews experience hate crimes disproportionate to any conceivable level of their population, that there is violence against people who are visibly Jewish, almost on a weekly, almost on a daily basis, in urban centers in America, and that their Jewish students, irrespective of how they code them racially, often feel threatened. I think if those messages could get through, the college presidents understand that, but they run complex organizations. If it could get through to their organizations, that would be important. And then I think a real line has to be drawn between the political beliefs of individual professors, which I said are both protected and legitimate, and the fact that programs, departments, majors should not be taking political views, because then you send a signal to people that they're not welcome, that debate is being stifled. And when 600 departments write a collective letter about the Israel-Palestine conflict, as happened last year, there's a problem. And so I think we have to reiterate the views that individual professors, individual faculties can have whatever views they want, but the institutions that they are part of do not take views. And of course, that's the very basis of the tax code of the United States, that nonprofit institutions don't take political views.
I want to pivot here. I mentioned your article, Ruinous Competition in the Jewish Future, which for anyone that hasn't read it, I mean, really Google it and read it. It's a fascinating article. It really cuts to the core of how the mainly nonprofit Jewish world sees the quote unquote concept of, or I should say the concept of quote unquote competition. You launch this, your university, I should say, launches this website called Maven, which is a tremendous digital resource for all different types of Jewish subjects, from Hebrew and Jewish thought to art and art history, culture, media, et cetera, et cetera. And I know it received a lot of backlash, which really spawned this article that I had mentioned. And I'm just curious, you mentioned to me right before we got on that, you have a different approach. And if you could just share a little bit more of your thinking behind not just Maven, the website, but really this different approach that you have, because it is quite different in my experience, reading this article, which is how I got to know you and reached out to you. You're bucking the trend. And I think it's fantastic. I also know that it comes with a lot of hurdles and probably headaches that you already have enough of those to begin with. So I'm just curious if you could take us into your thinking, your mindset, your approach to being different and doing different.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I'd say two things about my background that caused me to develop this particular approach. One is I was a social scientist long before I entered the Jewish communal world. And I studied how organizations rise and fall, prosper and fail. And second, I was head of the Newseum for several years, and then I came in at the tail end of the more or less complete disruption of the news ecosystem, especially by Google and Facebook. And I saw in particular the kind of wasteland of local newspapers and to some extent cable TV, profound organizations that had served their communities well for decades, which simply did not believe that people would abandon them with the advent of the internet. In fact, with Google and Facebook taking up much of the newspaper advertising revenue today, people did abandon those longstanding institutions relatively quickly, oftentimes to the detriment of our society, where significant areas of the country now have no local news coverage whatsoever. So I came into the current job understanding that the internet is a solvent, that it dissolves all barriers between the source, whether it's news or retail or whatever, and the customer, that intermediaries are all challenged. In March of 2020, when we thought we would be home for a few weeks while the curve was being flattened, and then we would return after the virus was defeated, we decided to establish a digital platform at American Jewish University, initially called Biachad, later called Maven, that sought to promote free programming and an increasing amount of paid programming for customers. And we found that there was a tremendous audience for that nationwide and internationally. It's really been, I think, a tremendous service to the population in general, the Jewish population, and those who are non-Jewish who want to learn more. But it's also, I think, increased the competition for ideas across the country. And I think that's a wonderful thing. We don't see ourselves competing with individual institutions, individual synagogues, individual JCCs. We think the more information, the more choice out there is better. And it's the same for our Miller Introduction to Judaism program, which has been taught by 70 or 80 different institutions in the United States, and is in fact the largest path to conversion in North America. When we hit the pandemic in March 2020, we put the Miller program online, the courses that we had been offering out of Los Angeles, and we found that the audience doubled. And when we look closely at who was taking the courses, the same number of people in Southern California were taking them as before, but we were also now attracting people from the East Coast, from Europe, from all over the world. And some of those people were coming from places that were already served by existing synagogues, existing JCCs that had similar programs. And we did get some pushback of people saying, how could you offer this digital program which encroaches on the geographic catchment area that my institution previously served? And our approach has been, we want to be extremely respectful to local leaders and local synagogues. And we always advise people taking our courses when there is a synagogue or a Jewish institution that is offering a program similar to Miller. But we never turn anyone away either if they want to take our program. And our approach is that the customer knows best, and that if he or she wants to attend a local program, that's fine. Or if he or she is living somewhere outside of Los Angeles and wants to attend our programs, that's good too. What I was surprised to find was that to some degree, there was an ingrained hostility in the Jewish world against this idea of competition, of this idea of offering the customer, as it were, choice. And there are long-standing rabbinic teachings actually against competition. I found that, realistically, we were going to offer the programs we were going to offer, but also it did remind me of my Newseum days, where local institutions, in that case, newspapers, thought they could insulate themselves against the pressures and opportunities offered by the internet. Not going to happen. Didn't happen with news. Didn't happen with bookstores. Didn't happen with a lot of retail. And one of the things I think we're going to have to come to grips with in the United States is that we have a large number of local institutions, synagogues, which have geographically defined audiences. And suddenly those audiences can go someplace else. And that is an enormous challenge.
You know, I was reading your article that you wrote in the Jerusalem Post with the title, "Do Jews Play Too Nice on College Campuses?" And I'm wondering if we could also ask the same question about Jewish lay leaders of organizations. Do Jewish nonprofit executives play too nice? Because while there are such things as business ethics and nonprofit ethics, you pointed out in your article, and I think anyone who knows anything about business knows that competition makes things better, more efficient, more of quality, et cetera. And so, you know, if we're always worried about encroaching on other people's territory, AKA playing too nice, at the expense oftentimes of putting out great products, services, and experiences to as many people as possible, frankly, then we're not going to ultimately produce those great products, services, and experiences. And that's not my opinion. That's the reality of the Jewish world. And that's been the reality of the Jewish world for God knows how long, decades, if not centuries. So I'm just wondering, I would ask you, Jeff, you know, are Jewish lay leaders playing too nice right now? Do we need to be more competitive, not trying to put each other out of business, so to speak, but trying to ultimately better and best serve the customer, as you call it, to deliver great Jewish experiences at some kind of scale?
Well, I mean, it's a profound question, and I would say it's an issue which is just as much affecting the nonprofit world as the Jewish world. So I'll give you my personal background. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, my father worked for IBM most of his career. And every year, he was particularly proud to bring home the Fortune magazine issue, which named IBM as one of the best or the best managed company, most respected company in the country, if not the world. And, you know, did amazing things developing mainframe computers. And then one day, IBM almost died. And it almost died because it could not understand the transition to the personal computer. And today, it's a mere shell of what it once was. And that experience, and we were an IBM family. We had Think notepads and IBM notepads all around the house. My father knew the IBM company song. And that IBM almost died one day was a profound lesson to me at a relatively early age, that institutions are fragile, even if they appear to be strong, that they have to continually renew themselves, or else they may be threatened severely as conditions change. We're used to tremendous dynamism in this country in the for-profit world. If you look at the corporate landscape today, the biggest companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, they bear no relationship to the top companies of 25 years ago. And if you go back 50 years ago, it's even more dynamic. And brands which everyone, you know, thought as dominant, like Pan Am Airways, don't exist anymore. We're used to that dynamism in the for-profit world, and we celebrate it. And it's one of the ways in which we've seen tremendous change be propelled. We don't have that attitude at all in the nonprofit world, much less in the Jewish world. There, the fact that institutions may not be durable, may not last forever, is taken as extremely challenging. And we don't expect the same dynamism in the nonprofit world. And what I believe is that nonprofit world, the Jewish world, changes are happening at such a fantastic rate that our organizations are either going to have to adapt the dynamism that we see in the for-profit world, not be for-profit, but be as dynamic, or face real challenges of viability. In my view, the changes in the North American Jewish community are seismic, irreversible, and we've only begun to see their manifestation. For many years, for instance, the talk was, how could we stop interfaith marriages? It's not going to be stopped. The Jewish community of the future is going to be much more complex than it was in the past. It's going to be much more multiracial. It's going to be much more diverse. At American Jewish University, we believe we're well suited to serve that population because we're a non-denominational, non-ideological university without a membership organization. So we don't serve a particular geographically defined audience. We want to serve the entire North American Jewish population. And unlike some other Jewish universities, which are profound and do a wonderful job, we don't have an ideology or a denomination that's which we adhere to. So we think that gives us the ability to be flexible and to innovate. And we think that's necessary. I think what you're going to see in colleges and universities, in the nonprofit world, in the Jewish world in the next few years, is really profound changes. And some people will come out of that great, some people won't, some will innovate, some won't. But the one thing I know is, coming out of, as I said, what I saw of local newspapers, the idea that we can just withstand these changes without innovating is highly unlikely.
So are you suggesting that effectively a lot of the organizations, including potentially your university, could not go out of business, but become so obsolete that it's as if they would have rather gone out of business? Or do you think that the incumbent, such as your university, such as, for example, the federations or Taglit Birthright Israel, can have the wherewithal to understand these challenges in this picture that you've painted and make some really hard and uncomfortable decisions to hopefully steer in the right direction?
Well, some will evolve and some won't. I'll give you just an example from our own university. We announced earlier this year that we would attempt to sell our Famillion campus in Bel Air because we have 22 acres of really prime real estate. And as we moved online and as we shifted the optic of who we're going to serve to beyond Los Angeles, we found we just didn't need that physical campus. Now, we'll still engage in some in-person instructions in the rabbinic school and elsewhere. We'll still have a physical presence, but we didn't need that campus, and we're in the process of selling it. Many people found that decision disconcerting. Some people, of course, have strong emotional ties to the campus, and that's understandable and legitimate. But some people couldn't get their mind around the idea that a college might move. And we said, companies move, people move, people revalue all the time their real estate and their land holdings as the economy changes and make decisions. Why shouldn't colleges and universities do the same? So we've reevaluated one of our campuses, and what's most important to us is to serve our mission of promoting the Jewish journey of individuals, organizations in our community. That mission statement doesn't say anything about holding a particular amount of real estate. And I was proud of our university and of our board that we made that decision. And I think it's the kind of decision that will have to be made by organizations if we're going to get through this extremely turbulent era and come through the other side. Now, we still have to execute on it, of course, but I think it's an example of trying to change with the times, because our mission is eternal. How we go about serving that mission has to change.
I'm really glad that you brought up that story, because I did read about it recently, and I know you got a lot of flack. And I'm just curious if you could, to the extent that you feel comfortable, of course, if you could give us a peek behind the curtain of some of those conversations that I'm sure you were having sort of off the record with people, right? Because I know before you make any presentation to any board or any committee, we always know there's back channel conversations, making sure that, you know, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Like that, like you said, you knew what you were up against, and I'm sure it wasn't just you. I'm sure there was a team of people, but you being the leader of the university, and probably, you know, the buck stops with you. Like, take us into some of those conversations that you had with yourself, those, you know, internal debates about, is this the right thing to do, is this not, how many people are going to get upset, how many people are going to be okay. I mean, what did that whole process look like from your vantage point as you ultimately got to that
As you
decision?
say, it was a multi-year process and a lot of discussions. And it really began in 2018 when the board, upon my recommendation, decided to close admissions and eventually teach out the undergraduate program of the university. The undergraduate program had struggled for many years, hadn't really reached critical mass. And it was my view that the resources that were being spent on it could be spent elsewhere. We taught that program out. We have almost no one remaining in the undergraduate program. But the undergraduates were the primary residents of our dormitories and the users of the playing fields. Then, before the pandemic, we already felt pressures to put some of our other programs online, largely, and you're from LA, I know, largely because of traffic issues. We were, for instance, providing programs for existing Jewish educational professionals. But those people were teaching in schools all day, teaching 4-year-olds. Then we were asking them to come to AJU at 4:30 in the afternoon for a couple of hours of classes. It was becoming increasingly non-viable. And already before the pandemic, online opportunities and the opportunity to teach online was becoming more powerful. So both our education and our MBA programs were already moving online because it was more practical and because that was the way the market was moving. Then the pandemic showed us that there was a tremendous audience for our adult education online programming. What our audience has told us is that they're not necessarily coming back, even post-pandemic, to in-person events. They'll come back if the value added of the in-person event is high, if it's a concert or something like that. But the book talk by an author, which used to be the run-of-the-mill program at AJU, that people are happy to view on Zoom from their living room. They've made their peace with Zoom. And our optics have changed also. You know, recently, one of my colleagues was complaining that only 300 people had registered for one of our online programs. And I said to her, if 75 people had appeared for an in-person programming on a Wednesday night before the pandemic, you would have been delighted. But our optics have changed. We used to think that AJU served a catchment area within 7 to 10 miles of campus. And that was fine because that was several million people. But now we're getting very large audiences for our programming on the East Coast, in South Africa, Israel, the UK. We've changed the timing of our programs to accommodate those time zones. And we don't want to give those audiences up either. So, you know, the pandemic has completely changed the aperture of which we look through and see our audience. So when we put that all together, we said, it's costing us a lot to maintain this campus. Our property insurance went up by a lot because of the fires in California. We had to construct a fence at a cost of close to $1 million. And now we have round-the-clock security because of the threats against all Jewish institutions. Things break. Things need to be maintained. And we said, you know, given the way our program is running, we need to have a physical presence, but we don't need to have this physical presence necessarily. So how can we unlock the value of the campus so that we can do what we're supposed to do, which is, as I said, promote our mission. So we still have to execute on that, but I was proud of the institution because we weren't beholden to old legacy costs and legacy structures. We were willing to think about something different. And I think one of the challenges of many Jewish institutions is they're so fixated on keeping what they have, keeping their existing membership, keeping their existing congregation, that they don't look out to the opportunities of the future and try to serve the North American Jewish community. Because the truth is, most Jews in North America are unaffiliated. They're not tied to any institution. So when you ask, how can we conserve what we have? How can we keep our current membership? You're not looking out to serve the North American Jewish community. You're just trying to save what you have. We have a more expansive view.
Appreciate that answer, Jeff. Two things that stood out to me there. I think, the first thing is a conversation about unaffiliated Jews. But first, I want to talk about the security aspect. You mentioned having to secure the perimeter of that piece of land. And we know specifically in the United States, right, the gun violence and the school shootings, mass shootings in general. And, we know the rising attacks, generated by anti-Semitism in the U.S. That piece of the puzzle is not exclusive to the U.S. But the first piece is. The second piece with the first piece creates a very, I would imagine, unsettling, situation for somebody like you who has a ton of people to be responsible for, not just your own staff and your own employees, but the students. And even the surrounding community. And so, again, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it, like when you see school shootings happening across the United States at a very frequent pace, and when you know that anti-Semitic attacks are also rising in the US, how do you deal with or think about the physical security of your employees and your campuses?
Well, it's not just a US issue. Of course, if you went to synagogues in Europe, a decade or more ago, I remember going to Passover services at a synagogue in Paris in the mid-2000s, and already there were gendarmes with machine guns outside. This is a long-standing issue of many places. Look, it's enormously disconcerting, especially at a university, because the very DNA of a university, our university, any university, is the open exchange of ideas, the movement of people, the interaction of people physically on a campus in a relatively unstructured way. Most universities are very open, and that's by design, because they want to express the very idea, which is at their core, that there should be freedom to discuss, freedom to move around. That sits very uneasily with the security threats generally in the United States and the very particular security threats against Jewish population. We're fortunate that we benefit from a lot of good advice from the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, from Homeland Security, from various California agencies. And we think we've taken the appropriate steps to harden the campus while staying true to our mission. And this is a constant balancing act and something which has to be reevaluated on a regular basis. I'd also say at the same time that if we live in fear and if we live in bunkers, then the bigots have won. That endlessly restricting our own freedom because we're afraid hurts us and causes the very paranoia and fear which the terrorists are trying to induce. So we can't do their job for them. We have to push back while at the same time being prudent.
I appreciate that. I want to get to your comment about the unaffiliated Jews. And as you were talking about that, I was just kind of thinking, we use this term a lot in the Jewish world, unaffiliated Jews. And first of all, it's a bit condescending now that I think about it, because ultimately I think what it comes down to, and this goes back to maybe our earlier conversation about competition and putting out better products, services, and experiences. When you say unaffiliated Jews or dropping institutional affiliation, I mean, that doesn't make them lesser Jews than maybe somebody like you or I. I think what I feel though is that a lot of organizations treat those groups. I don't know if the word's lesser, that's maybe a strong word, but marginalized, or they deserve special treatment, or there's a certain level of something that just doesn't sit right with me, where when a Jew is quote unquote unaffiliated, what they're really saying is, what you're offering me, Mr. or Mrs. Institution, is not good enough or does not bring enough value to my life for me to make the time and the effort and potentially the money available to you. And so I'm just curious, how you deal with that at, the university, but also how you think about it in general.
Well, I think you've described the problem well, which is the institutions which were at the bedrock of the Jewish community in the post-1945 era in the United States were largely membership organizations, synagogues, JCCs, and the like, which had a relatively defined memberships who they served in the vast majority of instances very well. And in turn, those memberships supported those organizations. And what's happened now is that's all changed, that the membership organizations are not necessarily serving a very large percentage of the population, and in turn are not being supported by them. And part of this is what's going on in the Jewish world, but part of this is just a reflection of what's happening in the United States. And I think one of the problems people who look at the Jewish world make is to look at us in isolation from greater trends in society. In society in general, people are joining fewer organizations. They're less connected. They're less supportive of local institutions. And what's happening in the Jewish world, therefore, is not that different, and the problem doesn't originate with us. It's something bigger, something structural. As I said, we have to face this paradox that we have a lot of local institutions which want to serve their own communities, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're looking at the bigger picture of what's happening with North American Jewry. I'd like to think that our university can be a very significant part of the answer to this problem, because a university does not have a membership structure as such. Our DNA is to look outward, to embrace as many people as possible. And AJU in particular, unlike a lot of institutions, devotes a very significant percentage of its resources to programs outside of matriculated degrees of formally enrolled students. We devote a lot of attention to adult general education. We devote a lot of attention to our introduction to Judaism classes, which are open to anyone. And I think therefore that, we have a posture of welcoming in everyone that's particularly appropriate, given that many people are signaling, as you say, that for one reason or another, they don't find the offerings of current institutions attractive enough to join.
Amazing. I really love that. I want to get to one last question for you, Jeff. You wrote a very recent article titled "Fighting Anti-Semitism with Help from, quote, Distant Relatives." And I never thought about this, but when I read this article, I was just blown away, because you're so right. I mean, basically what you talk about is, sort of these people that are not Jewish per se today, but when they do a genealogy test or an ancestry test, which are very common today, they find out that they had a Jewish relative. They have a little Jewish blood some time ago. And so, I'm just curious how you even got to that subject, and what you can tell us about it for people that haven't read the article.
Right. The article's in E-Jewish Philanthropy, appeared recently, and it's entitled, as you say, "Fighting Anti-Semitism with Distant Relatives." Through our Miller Introduction to Judaism program, which, as I said, is the largest conversion program in North America, but it's also a program where not everyone converts. A lot of people just want to learn more about Judaism. we started to pick up, as you say, I learned that I have an ancestor who's Jewish from 23andMe, or I'm the product of an interfaith marriage. But we also saw in other parts of the world, in South America, for instance, a large number of people are finding from genetic testing that they're the descendants of people who were forced to convert from the Iberian Peninsula. In Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, people whose parents or grandparents suppressed their Jewish identity are now finding out that they are Jewish. And then there are communities across the world that have decided to embrace Judaism. So really, for the first time in 2,000 years, there is a very significant population that seeks affinity with the Jewish people. Some want to convert. Most don't, frankly, but they want to learn more. They want to have some kind of association. And that's only becoming more powerful as genetic testing allows people to understand just how complex their identity and heritage is. So we had a conference in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in April where we explored this idea and found that there are these local phenomena, really in many different parts of the world, of people wanting to develop a closer association with the Jews. And it's a very profound thing, because I take the threats of anti-Semitism in the United States, across the world, very seriously today. But there's another narrative at the same time, which is not to deny the threats of anti-Semitism, but to say, look, there are other people who want to learn more about us, who want to become affiliated with us. And I think that's important. And we're going to be doing more work with a network of international scholars who are following this phenomenon, because I do think it's important in and of itself. It may have something very important to say about the fight against anti-Semitism. And it may also have something to say about the future of support for Israel. Because one of the phenomena today, of course, that we all have to be conscious of is that roughly 50% of the world's Jews are now in Israel. That's a remarkable change from even the recent past, when the global Jewish population was much more highly distributed. And while the project of bringing more Jews to Israel and growing the Jewish population has been a tremendous success, it does mean that the potential bases of support outside the country are fewer than before. If in fact these people who seek greater affinity with the Jews, and therefore in many cases Israel, can be mobilized, that can be a very powerful force for Israel.
Well said, my friend. Well, Jeff, it's really just been a pleasure to speak with you. You are, I don't say this a lot, but you're one of a kind, and we're really special to have you as part of the Jewish people. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's very kind. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about these issues, complex as they are, in this kind of format, and I'm really grateful to you.